It's your fault she's dead. If you hadn't argued with her that night, she might still be here." Those words, spoken in a cold, trembling voice at the funeral, cut deeper than any knife. I sat there on the worn wooden pew, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, as my sister-in-law's words echoed through the hushed room. My heart felt like it had turned to stone. The air was heavy with the scent of lilies and old candles, but I couldn't smell any of it. All I could feel was the weight of those words' accusations so sharp, they left me breathless. My sister-in-law, with her carefully composed face and her voice low and steady, made sure everyone could hear. Every relative, every friend, every neighbor who had come to mourn my mother's passing. Now they looked at me with eyes that weren't sure what to believe. I wanted to deny it, to stand up and shout that she was wrong, that I had loved my mother more than anything, that I would have given anything to keep her here. But the words wouldn't come. My throat felt raw, my mouth too dry to speak. She stood there framed by the soft glow of the candles, and she didn't blink as she spoke again. "You know it's true. You were the last one to see her. You were the one who made her cry that night." Her words fell into the silence like stones in a pond, rippling outward until they reached every ear in that room. I remembered that night in painful flashes, the argument, the tears that shone in Mother's eyes, the door that closed softly behind me when I left her room. I remembered how I'd stood in the hallway, my own tears hot and helpless, wanting to turn back, but too proud to do it. I didn't know those would be the last words we'd share. I didn't know she'd be gone by morning. I lowered my head, feeling the heat of shame rise in my cheeks. I could hear them all breathing the weight of their stares pressing down on me. My mother's friends, my cousins, even my brother shifting uncomfortably beside me. No one said a word to defend me. No one dared to break the heavy silence she had built with her lies. In that moment, I realized that my sister-in-law wasn't just trying to hurt me, she was trying to erase me, to turn me into the villain in a story that should have been about grief and love, not blame. And for the first time, I saw how carefully she had built her case, how she had turned her grief into a weapon sharp enough to cut me out of the family entirely. I lifted my head and looked at her, really looked. She met my gaze with cool indifference, as if she'd already won, as if my silence was the only proof she needed. But deep inside, something in me refused to break. I had lost my mother. I wouldn't lose myself too. The rest of the funeral passed in a blur of prayers and whispered condolences. When it was over, I stood by my mother's casket, tracing the soft curve of her hand one last time. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm sorry for the words I didn't say, for the things I can't take back." But in my heart, I knew I hadn't killed her. My love had never been a burden, and no matter what my sister-in-law said, that was the truth I would hold on to. I spent that night in the small room my mother had always kept ready for me, even after I'd moved out years ago. It still smelled faintly of lavender and old books, a scent that felt like home and loss all at once. I sat on the edge of the bed, tracing the pattern of the quilt she'd made by hand, each stitch a quiet testament to the way she loved. I closed my eyes and let the memories wash over me, each one a gentle ache in my chest. I saw her in the kitchen flour, dusting her hands, as she taught me how to bake bread, the way her own mother had taught her. I heard her laughter warm and musical, filling the small house with a light that could chase away even the darkest days. I remembered the nights she stayed up with me when I was sick, her cool hands pressing damp cloths to my forehead, her soft voice humming lullabies in the dark. I remembered how she'd slip notes of encouragement into my lunchbox, small scraps of paper that said things like, "You are enough, and I'm proud of you." Those moments weren't loud or dramatic. They were quiet, woven into the fabric of every day. But they were the foundation of my life, the proof of a love that had always been there, even when I doubted myself. I thought of the last night we'd spent together, the argument that had left us both in tears, the way her eyes had softened when she reached out to touch my hand, as if to say, "I'm still here even now." But I'd been too hurt, too stubborn to take that hand. I'd walked away, and now there was no going back. My sister-in-law's words echoed in my head, each one a sharp reminder of what she'd tried to take from me. She wanted to turn my grief into guilt, to twist the story so that I became the villain. But in the quiet of that room, surrounded by the things my mother had loved, I remembered the truth. My mother had never blamed me for that night. She had never thought my love was a burden. She knew that love is messy and complicated, that sometimes it shows itself in tears and angry words, but it is still love. She had taught me that. As I sat there, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt since the funeral strength. Not the loud kind that demands to be seen, but the quiet kind that lives in your bones. The kind that says, I know who I am. I know what she meant to me. I reached for the small wooden box on the nightstand, the one that held her letters, and the dried flowers she'd pressed between the pages of her favorite book. I opened it and ran my fingers over the delicate petals, brittle but still beautiful. In those small treasures, I found the proof that her love hadn't died with her. It lived on in me, in the memories we'd made together, in the lessons she'd taught me about kindness and patience, and the quiet courage it takes to forgive. I lay down on the bed, pulling the quilt up to my chin. The room was silent, but in that silence, I heard her voice soft and steady. You are enough. And in that moment, I knew that no matter what my sister-in-law said, no matter how loudly she tried to rewrite the story, I would always have this truth. My mother loved me, and that love would always be my refuge. The days after the funeral felt like moving through a fog, each hour heavy with the weight of unspoken words and sideways glances. My sister-in-law's accusations didn't end at the church. They followed me into the quiet conversations in the kitchen, the phone calls that stopped when I entered the room, the pitying looks from relatives who didn't know what to believe. It was subtle at first, a question here, a raised eyebrow there. Are you sure you didn't say something that upset her? One cousin asked, her voice low with concern that felt like judgment. She seemed so fragile those last weeks, another whispered. I wanted to scream to tell them they didn't know her like I did. They hadn't seen the quiet strength in her eyes, the way she found joy in the smallest moments, even when her body was tired. They hadn't seen how she held my hand, when I doubted myself how she smiled, even on the hardest days. But my sister-in-law was careful. She didn't shout or make a scene. She let the rumors spread like smoke, filling every corner of the house, until it felt like the walls themselves were whispering her lies. She spoke softly, her voice wrapped in concern that was more poison than comfort. She was so upset that night, she'd say, shaking her head sadly. I tried to tell her to rest, but you know how she worried. And then, well, you know how it ended. She never said it outright, but her meaning was clear. She wanted them to believe that I had pushed our mother over the edge, that her death was a wound I'd carved with my own hands. At night, I lay awake replaying that last conversation with Mother. The hurt in her eyes, the way her voice had broken when she said, "You're my daughter." I only wanted you to be happy. My throat ached with the words I hadn't said back. I'm sorry. I love you. I knew I wasn't perfect. I'd let my pride keep me from reaching out one more time. But I also knew that grief is a complicated thing, and love can survive even the hardest nights. My sister-in-law didn't care about that. She only cared about what she could gain. The jewelry was her real prize. My mother's delicate gold necklace, the bracelets she'd worn on special occasions, the heirloom ring she'd always said would be mine one day. They weren't just things, they were pieces of our family's story. My sister-in-law wanted them all, and she was willing to stain my name to get them. One afternoon, I walked past her room and saw her holding the jewelry box, her fingers running over the velvet lining, like it was already hers. She looked up and caught me watching. For a moment, there was something almost triumphant in her eyes. Then she smiled a small secret smile that chilled me to my bones. I realized then that this wasn't about me or even about Mother. It was about control, about rewriting the story of our family to suit her own needs. She wanted to be the one everyone pitied, the one everyone trusted. And if she had to bury me in lies to get there, she wouldn't hesitate. I stood there in the hallway, the silence pressing in around me, and made myself a promise. I wouldn't let her lies define me. I wouldn't let her turn my love for Mother into a weapon she could use against me. Because no matter how carefully she wove her web, the truth was mine to keep. The jewelry wasn't just a collection of glittering stones and precious metals. It was a map of my mother's life, each piece a story she wore close to her heart. The delicate gold necklace that had belonged to her grandmother, the tiny earrings she wore on her wedding day, the silver bracelet she'd let me play with as a child, tracing its patterns with small, fascinated fingers. They were treasures, but not because of their worth. They were the quiet symbols of her resilience, her pride, her love. When my mother wore them, she carried the memories of every milestone she'd lived through, birthdays, anniversaries. Even the small triumphs she never thought anyone noticed. My sister-in-law saw none of that. To her, the jewelry was just an inheritance, a way to anchor her place in the family she'd married into. She wanted the pieces for herself, and she'd found the perfect excuse to claim them, the lie that I was the cause of Mother's death. I found her one afternoon in Mother's room, the velvet-lined box open in her lap. She was holding the heirloom ring between her fingers, turning it slowly so the light caught the worn etchings in the band. When she saw me standing in the doorway, she didn't flinch. She just smiled, a smile so small and cold, it made my blood run like ice. "This was always meant to be mine," she said softly, her eyes never leaving the ring. "Mother said it would come to me one day." "You know that, don't you?" I said nothing. I didn't trust myself to speak, not when my throat felt tight with anger and grief. I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that Mother had promised me that ring. On the night I graduated, her fingers brushing my hair back, as she whispered, "One day this will be yours." But I knew she wouldn't believe me. She'd already decided what story she wanted to tell. She slipped the ring onto her finger, turning it this way and that, as if testing how it looked, how it felt to wear a piece of someone else's history. "It suits me," she said, her voice light, almost playful. Don't you think I turned and walked away before I said something I couldn't take back? In the hallway, my hands curled into fists at my sides. My mother's jewelry didn't belong to her. It belonged to the love and laughter that had filled our home, to the memories that no amount of greed could touch. But she didn't see that. She didn't see the late nights Mother had spent polishing those pieces, or the way her eyes would light up when she put them on for family dinners. To her, they were just trophies. Proof that she'd won something, even if she had to break me to claim it. I went back to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the small wooden box that held the letters and dried flowers I'd gathered over the years. They were my own inheritance pieces of my mother's heart that no one could take away. In that quiet moment, I promised myself I would not let her turn those treasures into weapons. I would not let her lies tarnish the truth of who my mother had been, or who I was. The confrontation came on a cold morning, the kind where the sky is a pale gray, and the world feels hushed and waiting. I found her in the kitchen, her back to me, as she poured coffee into a delicate china cup, Mother's cup, the one with the tiny blue flowers around the rim. She held it like it belonged to her, like everything in this house now had her name etched into it. I took a breath and stepped forward. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady, even though my heart was pounding so loudly I thought she might hear it. She turned the cup poised in her hand and gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes. About what she asked, her tone so casual, it was almost a mockery. "About the lies," I said. My voice was calm, but I could feel the words like coals on my tongue. "About what you're telling everyone. About what you're trying to make them believe." She raised one eyebrow, a delicate arch that made her look almost amused. "I'm just telling the truth," she said softly. "If that makes you uncomfortable, maybe it's because you know it's real." "It's not the truth," I shot back, my voice sharper now. "You know it's not. You're twisting everything to make yourself look like the victim, to make them pity you." She sipped her coffee, her eyes never leaving mine. "And what if I am?" she said lightly. "You've always been Mother's favorite. You had everything handed to you while I had to earn my place. Maybe I'm just evening the scales?" I stared at her, stunned by the coldness in her voice. "This isn't about fairness," I said, my voice low. "This is about Mother, about the way you're trying to steal the memory of her, just like you're trying to steal her jewelry." For a moment, her smile slipped, the mask of composure cracking. "You're so naive," she said, her voice suddenly sharp. "You think love is enough to protect you, that your memories will keep you safe from the truth I'm telling everyone." "No," I said quietly. But I know the difference between truth and lies, and so will they one day." She set the cup down a little too hard, the delicate china rattling against the saucer. "You're weak," she spat. "You always have been. That's why Mother coddled you, why she never let you stand on your own. She knew you couldn't handle the real world." I took a deep breath, feeling the quiet strength I'd built in the days since Mother's death settle around me like a shield. "Maybe I am softer than you," I said. "But that doesn't mean I'm weak. It means I know what matters. It means I won't let your lies change the way I remember her." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The kitchen was filled with the tick of the old clock on the wall, the quiet hum of the refrigerator. She looked at me like she wanted to say more, but in the end, she just turned away, her shoulders stiff, as she picked up the cup again. I left the room without another word, my hands shaking, but my heart steady. I knew she wouldn't stop. I knew the battle wasn't over, but I also knew that I wouldn't let her win. Not with the truth of who Mother was, or the truth of who I had become. I left the kitchen that day, feeling like I was stepping out of a storm into a clear sky. The house felt different, the air almost still, as if it was holding its breath along with me. I went to my room and closed the door gently behind me, needing a moment to gather the pieces of myself she'd tried to scatter. I sat on the edge of my bed, the quilt under my fingers, soft and worn. I thought of Mother's hands, how she used to mend torn seams, with a quiet patience that seemed endless. She had taught me that real strength doesn't have to shout to be heard. It doesn't have to fight to prove itself. It's in the gentle way you refuse to give up, even when no one else is watching. I realized then that I didn't need to match my sister-in-law's venom. I didn't need to fight her with the same bitterness she carried in her voice. My love for Mother, my memories, my quiet presence, these were my strength. They were what she could never take from me, no matter how many lies she told. I began to spend my days in the small routines that made me feel close to Mother. I watered the plants she used to tend their leaves soft and green under my fingertips. I dusted the old bookshelf where her favorite novels sat, each one worn at the edges from her gentle touch. I cooked her recipes, the ones she'd taught me, standing side by side in the kitchen, her hands guiding mine, her laughter filling the warm air. Each stir of the spoon, each pinch of salt was a small prayer, a way of keeping her alive in the spaces she once filled. At night, I wrote in my journal, the words flowing from my pen in the soft lamplight. I wrote about her kindness, her patience, the way she always knew how to make a room feel like home. I wrote about the quiet courage she taught me, the kind that doesn't need to be loud to be real. Sometimes I still heard the whispers relatives, unsure of what to believe neighbors, who watched me with curious eyes. But I didn't let their uncertainty become mine. I knew who I was. I knew what Mother had meant to me, and in the quiet of my own heart, that was enough. One evening, I found a photograph of Mother and me taken on a sunny afternoon years ago. We were both laughing, her arm wrapped around my shoulders, my head tilted against hers. The picture was worn, the edges curled from years of handling. I slipped it into a small frame and placed it on the nightstand, a quiet monument to a love that didn't need defending. She could have the jewelry, the house, the empty victory of her lies. I wouldn't trade places with her for all the gold in the world. Because what I had, what I still had, was something she could never understand, the simple, steady certainty of a heart that knows how to love. And in the end, that was what mattered most. My quiet strength, my truth, the soft, unbreakable thread of Mother's love that ran through every memory, every breath, every beat of my own heart. A few days later, as I sat in the small, sunlit room that had become my refuge, the phone rang. I almost didn't answer, but something in me, some small flicker of curiosity or maybe hope, pushed me to pick it up. It was Aunt Margaret, Mother's oldest friend. Her voice was warm and soft, a balm against the sharp words I'd grown used to. "I heard what she's been saying," Aunt Margaret said quietly, and I could hear the sadness in her voice. I didn't believe a word of it. My throat tightened. "Thank you," I whispered. "She's clever," Aunt Margaret continued her words, careful but steady. "She knows how to make her story sound real. But I remember your mother better than anyone." I know how she looked at you, how proud she was always. I closed my eyes, letting the comfort of those words wash over me. I'd needed to hear them more than I'd realized. I've tried to tell everyone I said softly, but it feels like I'm shouting into a storm. I know, dear, she said, her voice gentle. But storms pass, and the truth has a way of finding its way through no matter how loud the wind howls. We talked for a long time, sharing stories of Mother, how she'd once stood in the rain for hours to watch me sing in a school play, how she'd laughed so hard at one of Aunt Margaret's jokes she'd nearly fallen out of her chair. Each memory was a light in the darkness, a reminder that I wasn't alone in remembering who Mother truly was. Before she hung up, Aunt Margaret said, "You carry her in you, you know. Every kindness she gave you, every lesson she taught you, that's yours to keep, no matter what anyone else says." When I set the phone down, my hands were still trembling, but I felt stronger somehow. I looked around the small room, the morning light spilling across the faded rug, and felt Mother's presence there, quiet and sure. Later that day, I found a small envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a note in Aunt Margaret's careful script. "If you ever need to tell your story, I'll be here to listen, and I'll help them hear the truth too." I pressed the note to my heart and whispered a silent thank you. Because I knew then that while my sister-in-law's lies were loud and persistent, they weren't invincible. There were people who remembered, people who saw through the shadows she tried to cast. That evening, I sat down at the little table by the window and wrote Aunt Margaret a letter of my own. I wrote about the quiet mornings I'd spent with Mother, the way her laughter filled the house, the small moments of love that had shaped me. Each word was a small act of reclamation, a way of stitching my story back together. I didn't know how long the fight would last or how many more lies she would tell, but I knew I wasn't alone, and that knowledge was enough to keep me going. Because in the end, it wasn't about the jewelry or the stories she told. It was about the truth that lived in my heart, the truth that no one could steal. The next day, I found myself standing in the living room of my mother's house, surrounded by faces that had grown familiar over years of family gatherings, cousins, neighbors, friends, who had known me since I was a child. They watched me with eyes that were cautious but curious, waiting for the next chapter of the story they'd been fed in hushed whispers. My sister-in-law was there too, her arms folded across her chest, her expression carefully neutral. She wore Mother's jewelry that day, the heirloom ring catching the light as she moved her hand. I forced myself to look at her, to see her not as a villain in my story, but as a woman driven by fear and greed. I took a deep breath, steadying my voice. I know there have been a lot of things said I began. My words were calm, deliberate, things that make it sound like I was the cause of her death, that I didn't love her the way a daughter should. The room was silent, the weight of their attention pressing into me. My heart pounded, but I didn't let it show. "I won't pretend that night wasn't hard," I said, my voice steady. "We argued. We said things we didn't mean. But if love was measured only in perfect moments, none of us would have anything to hold on to." I paused, letting the truth settle around us like a soft blanket. Mother and I, we weren't perfect, but we loved each other deeply. She taught me to be patient, to be kind, to find strength in the quietest corners of myself. That's the truth I carry. My sister-in-law shifted her weight, her fingers tightening around her wrist. "You can say whatever you want," she said coolly, "but we all know what happened." I turned to her, then my gaze calm and unwavering. "You can twist the story any way you like," I said softly, "but you can't rewrite the years I spent by her side. The nights I sat by her bed, the meals we shared, the laughter that filled this house." Around me, heads nodded slowly, small gestures of belief, of memories that couldn't be erased by her words alone. I saw it in their eyes, the understanding that grief is never simple, that love can be messy and flawed, and still be real. I continued, my voice growing stronger. She didn't leave this world with anger in her heart. She left with the knowledge that she was loved. That's what matters to me. That's what I'll hold on to no matter what anyone says. For a moment, the room was completely still. Then Aunt Margaret stepped forward, her eyes shining with quiet pride. "I remember," she said softly. "I remember how she looked at you, how her face would light up when you walked into the room. That's the truth I know, My sister-in-law's mouth tightened, but she said nothing. She turned away, her shoulders stiff, as she moved to the edge of the room. I watched her go, not with anger, but with a kind of sad understanding. She could keep the jewelry, could hold on to it like a trophy. But she'd never have the warmth of the memories, the quiet strength of knowing what love really looks like. I walked out of that house feeling lighter than I had in weeks. The battle wasn't over, but in that moment, I knew I had won something more important than any inheritance. I had reclaimed the story of my mother's love and my own place in it. In the weeks that followed, I found a quiet rhythm in my days, like the steady beat of a song I'd always known, but had nearly forgotten. I no longer felt the weight of her words like I once did. They still echoed, of course, in the corners of conversations, and in the guarded looks of those who didn't know what to believe. But I had stopped trying to convince them. I knew who I was, and that was enough. I spent my mornings in the garden, tending to the small patch of green that Mother had loved so dearly. The scent of rosemary and the soft rustle of leaves were like a balm, each touch of soil a reminder of the gentle lessons she had taught me. In the afternoons, I wrote letters to her in my journal, things I wished I'd said, memories I wanted to keep alive. Each word felt like a stitch, mending the parts of my heart she had once held in her hands. Sometimes I would find myself holding a piece of her jewelry, a delicate brooch she'd worn to family gatherings, a thin gold chain that had once rested against her throat. My sister-in-law might have taken them for herself, but they still carried Mother's warmth, her laughter, her unwavering love. They were never just things. They were pieces of her, and in my memories, they would always be safe. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the first stars began to shimmer in the sky, I sat on the old wooden bench in the garden and let the memories wash over me. I saw her there in every gentle breeze, in the soft glow of twilight, in the quiet strength I'd found in myself. She had always been there, even when I couldn't see her. I realized then that my legacy wasn't in the jewelry or the house or the stories my sister-in-law tried to twist. My legacy was in the love I carried forward, in the small patient acts of kindness that had shaped my life. It was in the way I chose to stand firm, not with anger or bitterness, but with the quiet certainty that love cannot be stolen. It can only be given freely again and again. When I closed my eyes, I felt her voice like a soft echo in my heart. "You are enough. You always have been." And I knew finally that she was right. I don't know what the future will bring. There will always be those who choose to see only the shadows, who believe the loudest voice instead of the truest one. But I have learned that the only voice that truly matters is the one in my own heart, the one that whispers of love, of forgiveness, of the quiet victories no one else can see. So I stand here now in the gentle twilight of my mother's garden, and I let the peace of this moment fill me. I know who I am. I know what I've lived and what I've lost, and what I've found again in the quiet spaces of my own heart. And that is enough. And if you've ever had to fight to hold on to your truth, to protect the memory of someone you loved, tell me. Let's share those stories, those small acts of courage, and remind each other that our legacies are written in love, not in the lies others try to tell.